Sophie expected a routine private briefing. Instead, a sealed document placed before her by the late Queen's trustees carried a decision so personal that she stopped reading halfway through the first page. Queen Elizabeth had preserved one of her most private royal distinctions outside the normal machinery of succession, and now the trustees were formally declaring that Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, was the woman chosen to inherit it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Sophie looked again, as if the words might change. She had entered Windsor, expecting clarification about Elizabeth's charitable papers. The trustees, a small group entrusted with carrying out Elizabeth's private wishes, had instead opened a sealed instruction naming her as the next holder and custodian of a private honorary royal title rooted in the Queen's household tradition. It was not a constitutional office or a place in the succession. It was something more intimate, a mark of trust preserved beyond her lifetime. Edward watched his wife lower the page. He had seen her composed through years of duty, but this was different. Sophie asked whether there had been some mistake. She knew how carefully Elizabeth guarded personal distinctions, and that knowledge made the moment harder to absorb. Edward understood why. This was not simply an honor from a sovereign. It was a judgment from his mother about character, loyalty, and who could carry something private without turning it into spectacle. The trustee answered without hesitation. Elizabeth had made the designation herself, but the instruction had been held outside normal palace announcements. Several conditions in her private directive had to be completed before the envelope could be opened. That directive, in plain terms, was a set of personal instructions explaining when and how the Queen wanted the decision carried out. Sophie listened as the trustee turned the page. Then the signature appeared. Sophie leaned closer. Elizabeth's own hand sat beneath the confirmation, removing any possibility that this was later interpretation or ceremonial accident. Edward looked from the signature to his wife and saw disbelief give way to something heavier. Grief had entered the room with the revelation. The Queen had planned this while alive, kept it hidden, and trusted time itself to deliver the message. Sophie placed the paper flat on the table, her voice quiet. Who else knew? The trustees exchanged a glance before answering. Someone inside the king's household had known enough to understand what came. Sophie had just learned what Elizabeth had given her, but the heavier question was why the late Queen believed this particular honor had to bypass almost everyone else. The title shocked Sophie because she understood exactly what it represented. This was not simply another ribbon, patronage, or ceremonial privilege. It was rooted in trust, the kind Queen Elizabeth rarely expressed openly and almost never committed to paper without reason. Behind the formal language was something intensely personal, years of private loyalty, difficult family moments, and a relationship between two women that had deepened far away from cameras. Sophie had never entered royal life expecting to become one of the Queen's most dependable figures. Her marriage to Edward brought her close to Elizabeth, but without the crushing expectations placed on direct heirs or future monarchs. That mattered. It allowed trust to grow quietly, especially during years when the royal family faced internal strain and fewer senior members were available to carry public duty. A patronage, in simple terms, is an official cause or organization supported by a royal, but this new distinction reached far beyond ordinary public service. Edward understood that difference immediately. He remembered how often his wife had stepped forward without demanding recognition, and he knew his mother had noticed. Sophie, meanwhile, could barely move past one sentence in the document. It brought back one of her final private conversations with Elizabeth, when the Queen had thanked her for never making duty about yourself. At the time, the words had seemed affectionate. Now they felt deliberate, almost like a message planted years before this moment. Edward reached for her hand when she fell silent, but Sophie gently pulled the document closer instead. She needed to finish every line. Pride mixed with grief across his face, because the judgment on that page came from his mother, and hearing it preserved in writing made her absence feel suddenly sharper. The honor felt like praise, but it also reopened loss. The trustees then disclosed something neither of them expected. Elizabeth had begun considering Sophie for the distinction years earlier, long before anyone inside the household suspected she was planning who would inherit it. One handwritten annotation beside her name described the future holder as someone capable of protecting the honor from becoming political, competitive, or performative. Sophie read the phrase twice. Then, another line stopped her completely. Elizabeth's instructions referred to the incident at Balmoral. Sophie looked toward Edward, but he seemed just as unsettled. Neither had expected a private family moment to appear inside a formal succession document, meaning a written plan for who would inherit a role after the current holder. Whatever had happened at Balmoral had clearly changed Elizabeth's thinking. The answer to Sophie's selection was not hidden in decades of royal history. It was buried in one evening at Balmoral that changed Elizabeth's mind permanently. Years before the trustees opened Elizabeth's instruction, one private evening at Balmoral transformed Sophie's relationship with the Queen. It began as an ordinary family gathering and ended with a conversation so serious that Elizabeth later returned to her rooms and altered a personal succession document. Those present did not understand its significance at the time. Sophie herself never knew that her actions that night would ultimately determine who inherited the Queen's most private title. Tension had already been building inside the family. Different royal households were arguing over responsibilities, ceremonial precedents, and who should safeguard several traditions closely associated with Elizabeth. Ceremonial precedents simply meant the formal order in which royals appeared or were positioned during official occasions, and normally it was handled with quiet precision. That evening, however, one proposed change became personal. Sophie had entered the gathering trying to calm nerves, not improve her own standing, yet suddenly she found herself at the center of the dispute. Elizabeth called Sophie aside after another family member challenged the arrangement and privately offered to elevate her ceremonial position. The gesture should have felt like victory. Instead, she refused. Sophie told the monarch that family peace mattered more than where she stood during ceremonies, and she would rather step back than allow an honor to deepen resentment. Elizabeth remained silent for several seconds. The refusal had revealed something she had been searching for. Ambition was not driving the woman standing before her. Sophie later found Edward and admitted she feared she had gone too far. She worried that refusing the Queen directly might have appeared ungrateful, even disrespectful. Edward tried to reassure his wife, but he could not know what Elizabeth was thinking. Sophie replayed the conversation repeatedly, convinced she might have embarrassed the monarch at the worst possible moment. Elizabeth, however, reached an entirely different conclusion. After midnight, she summoned her private secretary and ordered Sophie's name inserted into a confidential succession memorandum governing the private title. A succession memorandum was simply a written instruction explaining who should receive a particular responsibility after its current holder was gone. The Queen also imposed one extraordinary condition: Sophie must never be told while Elizabeth remained alive. That condition mattered deeply. Elizabeth wanted the trusted confidant's conduct to remain untouched by expectation, reward, or ambition. Sophie would continue serving without knowing she had already been chosen. Elizabeth signed the page, closed the folder, and spoke 5 quiet words. Then it is settled. Years later, that same signature now rested before Sophie. But the title Elizabeth protected so carefully could not be transferred without consequences. And the first person forced to confront those consequences was King Charles. Sophie did not celebrate. Before any announcement could be discussed, she requested one private conversation with Charles. No advisors, no private secretaries, no prepared palace wording. She needed to know whether the king had been blindsided and whether accepting his mother's final instruction would create a fracture inside the family. When Charles finally entered the room, Sophie immediately understood from his expression that he already knew everything. Charles had been informed only shortly before she was. The trustees had contacted him because, as monarch, he had to acknowledge a private designation that touched the royal household, even though he had no authority to rewrite it. That distinction mattered. Elizabeth's personal legacy structure was simply the private framework she used to preserve certain wishes outside ordinary crown appointments, meaning this was not a role the king could casually transfer, cancel, or hand to someone else. Sophie spoke first. She told Charles that if accepting the honor threatened his reign, embarrassed Camilla, or placed Edward in an impossible position, she would decline it. The offer was immediate, almost instinctive. She had spent years avoiding competition inside the family, and the idea that Elizabeth's final trust might now become a source of division unsettled her more than losing the title ever could. Charles reacted with frustration, but not at Sophie. He admitted that discovering how carefully his mother had protected the decision had shaken him. Elizabeth had once told him, in a private conversation preserved in his own documented account, that some things should remain beyond the reach of hierarchy. At the time, he believed she was speaking philosophically. Now he understood she had turned that belief into a formal instruction, designed to survive even a monarch's disagreement. Sophie then asked the question both had been avoiding. Did Camilla know? Charles paused. The Queen Consort had known the old title existed, he said, but she had never been told that Elizabeth had selected a successor. That silence changed the emotional weight of the room. Sophie understood immediately that accepting the honor might be read not simply as trust in her, but as a judgment on someone else. Charles walked away, said nothing for several long seconds, then turned back toward her. His voice was controlled when he finally spoke. "If she chose you, I will not undo her judgment." Sophie did not smile. Relief came with a cost, because the king's acceptance ended the question of intervention while opening another wound entirely. And both knew who would feel that verdict most deeply. Charles had removed the threat of royal intervention, but inside the palace, the decision was already becoming something more dangerous than an inheritance. It was becoming a verdict. The deeper the palace examined Elizabeth's instructions, the clearer the design became. She had anticipated resistance. Every signature, every condition, every delay had been arranged to prevent emotional pressure after her death from reshaping her choice. What appeared at first like a sentimental family gesture was actually a meticulously protected transfer of responsibility, and at the center of the mechanism was one uncomfortable reality. The trustees, not the household, controlled the final step. Sophie returned to the table, knowing the decision was larger than sentiment. Elizabeth's private trust was a small body she had personally appointed to protect a royal tradition built around service, discretion, and stewardship, rather than constitutional power. In simple terms, the trustees existed to make sure her private wishes could not be altered after her death. They could authenticate the instruction, confirm that every condition had been satisfied, and only then carry out the transfer exactly as she had written it. One senior trustee opened the document and read the central clause aloud. Sophie remained composed until she heard herself described as Elizabeth's preferred keeper of continuity. The phrase unsettled her immediately. It sounded too close to a ranking, too easy for others to twist into proof that one royal woman had been placed above another. She interrupted before the trustee could continue and made her position clear. She would not accept anything that could be used against Camilla, Catherine, or anyone else in the family. The trustee answered by turning to another page. Elizabeth had anticipated precisely that danger. Her written instructions stated that the title could never be used to claim precedence over the Queen Consort or the Princess of Wales. Precedence, in plain language, meant the formal order in which senior royals were ranked during official occasions. The honor gave Sophie responsibility, not superiority. That distinction had been protected deliberately. Sophie then learned the second safeguard. No monarch, household official, or family member could force her to surrender the distinction. Only a personally signed renunciation from Sophie herself could end her role. A renunciation simply meant a formal written decision to give something up voluntarily. The structure was unmistakable. Elizabeth had designed the title to survive pressure from every direction. Sophie closed the folder. Her voice was steady when she told the trustees she would accept only if the honor remained exactly what Elizabeth intended. A responsibility, never a trophy. The room fell quiet. Her condition earned immediate respect, but beyond that door, the decision was already moving through the palace, and one reaction was becoming impossible to contain. Sophie had accepted Elizabeth's burden on her own terms, but acceptance changed the palace instantly, and the first visible fallout came from Camilla. Camilla learned the truth not through a newspaper or whispered corridor gossip, but during a scheduled household briefing. The words were delivered carefully. The reaction was anything but routine. For several seconds, the Queen Consort said nothing. Then she asked whether Elizabeth's document explained why Sophie had been chosen. That question exposed the real wound. The title itself mattered, but what Elizabeth's preference appeared to imply about confidence and intimacy mattered far more. Camilla had always known that Elizabeth maintained certain personal traditions outside everyday royal administration. Some were private customs, others were quiet responsibilities passed through trusted hands, but she had never been given access to every instruction. That mattered now, because Sophie's appointment did not follow formal rank. The distinction rested on personal trust, and that made it emotionally different from queenship, which was the public role held by the monarch's wife within the royal structure. Camilla looked down at the briefing folder and asked one question more quietly than the first. Had she ever been considered? The aide hesitated, then answered from the documented instruction. No alternative names appeared anywhere in the file. Sophie's was the only one. The answer landed harder than any argument could have. Camilla rose, as if the meeting were over, but once the room emptied, she sat down again. Anger had already begun turning into something closer to rejection. Charles found her later with the document still open. He explained that Elizabeth had deliberately separated the private title from queenship and had written that the distinction should never be interpreted as criticism of the reigning consort. In plain language, the instruction made clear that Sophie's honor was personal, while Camilla's position belonged to an entirely different royal duty. Charles repeated the point carefully, knowing logic could explain the structure without removing the hurt. Camilla then noticed the smallest detail on the page. Sophie's name had not merely been typed into the final instruction. Elizabeth had written it herself. That single handwritten choice made the decision feel painfully intimate. Charles saw the change in her expression and understood that his mother's explanation could not erase what those few strokes of ink seemed to represent. Camilla removed her reading glasses and placed them beside the folder. She looked at Charles before speaking. "Then, we must make sure this does not become a contest." The king gave a slow nod. Her restraint prevented the first real fracture, but another decision was already taking shape elsewhere in the palace. Sophie wanted to speak to Camilla alone. The institution had said almost everything it could say. What remained could only be resolved woman to woman, without titles standing between them. No aides entered with them. No written statement waited on the table. Sophie and Camilla met privately because both understood that official language could not solve what Elizabeth's decision had stirred up. One woman had inherited an intensely personal honor. The other now carried the public position of queen. Their conversation could either turn Elizabeth's final wish into a lasting source of resentment, or finally separate personal trust from royal rank. Sophie had requested the meeting herself. She refused to let palace officials manage a relationship now in danger of being defined by speculation, whispered comparisons, and imagined rivalry. Camilla agreed for the same reason. A hidden hierarchy, meaning an unofficial ranking people might read into royal relationships, could damage both women if Elizabeth's private choice was presented as proof that one had somehow defeated the other. Neither wanted that interpretation to take control. Sophie spoke first. She told Camilla that she did not see the inherited distinction as a judgment against her, nor would she allow courtiers to use it that way. If anyone attempted to turn Elizabeth's trust into a weapon, Sophie said she would reject the comparison publicly and privately. Camilla listened without interrupting, but the hurt remained. Then she admitted what had troubled her most. Camilla said the pain was not that Sophie had received something precious. It was Elizabeth's silence. For years, she had wondered how deeply the late queen had truly accepted her beyond duty and necessity. Sophie understood immediately. That question was not about rank, it was about belonging, and no ceremonial explanation could erase it. Sophie opened the folder and shared a line Camilla had not yet been shown. Elizabeth had written that different women would carry different burdens, and none diminishes the other. The sentence changed the tone instantly. Camilla recognized the language as deeply characteristic of the monarch, who had always separated affection from duty and responsibility from competition. Suddenly, the choice felt less like exclusion and more like careful division of trust. Silence followed. Sophie pushed the folder away and promised she would never invoke the title against Camilla. The queen consort looked at her before answering. "Then neither will I let anyone use it against you." Something shifted between them. Not friendship rewritten overnight, not hurt magically erased, but a boundary drawn against rivalry. Their private agreement settled the family tension at the exact moment the palace began preparing its public announcement. Inside the room, the rivalry had been diffused. Outside it, millions were about to decide for themselves what Elizabeth's final choice meant. By morning, the private decision belonged to the public. The palace statement was restrained, but the reaction was anything but. Commentators seized on Elizabeth's handwritten designation. Supporters focused on Sophie's years of quiet service. Critics searched for hidden messages about Camilla, Catherine, and the future direction of the monarchy. Yet one image outside Windsor captured the mood better than any debate. People arriving not to protest, but to leave handwritten notes, thanking Sophie for serving quietly. Sophie watched the first wave of coverage beside Edward, and immediately understood how quickly meaning could be distorted. The official announcement described the distinction as a personal legacy honor, meaning a private responsibility passed down by Elizabeth rather than a constitutional office carrying formal power. That wording mattered because it protected the roles already held by Camilla and Catherine. Neither woman had been displaced. Sophie had received something intimate, not something that changed the royal order. Edward noticed her unease as the headlines became sharper. Several reports framed the inheritance as a victory over other royal women, language Sophie had feared from the beginning. She told him quietly that Elizabeth would have hated seeing trust turned into competition. Edward answered that she could not control every headline or argument. She could only control what she did with what his mother had placed in her hands. By evening, the story had grown even larger. One major broadcaster opened its royal coverage with the handwritten line naming Sophie, describing the document as the emotional center of Elizabeth's final personal decision. The attention shifted instantly from ceremony to character. People were no longer asking only what the title was. They were asking what the Queen had seen in Sophie that made her choice so certain. Outside Windsor Castle, that question took on a human form. A small crowd gathered behind the barriers, while nearby newspaper stands carried Sophie's portrait beneath 4 enormous words. The Queen's final trust. Some people left flowers. Others left notes. Then Sophie saw footage of an elderly woman holding a handwritten card that read, "She knew who stayed." Sophie looked away. Edward stayed beside her without speaking until she regained her composure. That simple message had cut through every argument about status, hierarchy, and rivalry. For Sophie, the honor suddenly felt less like something the world was debating and more like something Elizabeth was still asking her to protect. Public interpretation remained divided, but her own understanding had become clear. The headlines could define the moment for a day. Sophie's next decision would define what it meant forever. In the end, Sophie's inheritance did not rearrange the monarchy. It revealed something deeper about it. Queen Elizabeth had spent a lifetime surrounded by hierarchy, ceremony, precedence, and expectation, yet her most private choice ignored all of them. She selected the person she believed would protect an honor without exploiting it. And Sophie's final response proved why that trust had been placed in her. She accepted without turning the gift into power. Sophie understood by then that the distinction had never replaced queenship, altered succession, or elevated her constitutional position. Succession, in simple terms, is the legal order determining who inherits the crown. And nothing in Elizabeth's private instruction changed that structure. Its meaning rested somewhere far more personal. The late queen had left behind a judgment of character, not a new chain of command. and Charles decided the palace would respect that boundary exactly as his mother had designed it. Charles made his position unmistakable. He rejected every attempt to turn the inheritance into a contest between Sophie and Camilla, while the Queen Consort publicly supported the announcement and refused to feed suggestions of rivalry. Sophie responded in the same spirit. She asked for no grand ceremony, no higher precedence, and no visible privilege beyond what Elizabeth had actually intended. The king understood that restraint was what finally brought institutional closure. Sophie later admitted to Edward that one sadness remained. She wished Elizabeth had told her while alive. One final conversation, one chance to ask why, would have meant more than any honor delivered after death. Edward listened before offering the answer she had struggled to see. Perhaps his mother's silence was part of the gift. Elizabeth wanted Sophie's loyalty to remain entirely her own choice until the very end. That realization changed everything. Sophie finally understood that secrecy had never meant distrust. It had been the ultimate test of authenticity. Elizabeth wanted to know that kindness would remain kindness without promised recognition, that duty would remain duty without reward, and that loyalty would survive without anyone watching for a prize. Later, Sophie folded Elizabeth's letter carefully and placed it back inside its case. Edward remained beside her as she said she would carry the honor exactly as the Queen had lived, quietly. Elizabeth's final choice had never been about choosing one royal woman over another. It was about preserving loyalty without spectacle, responsibility without ambition, and affection without demand. Sophie did not emerge as the monarchy's most powerful woman. She emerged as the woman Elizabeth trusted with something power could never guarantee. And that was the true meaning of the title Elizabeth left behind. Not a crown above Sophie's head, but a final expression of confidence placed quietly in her hands, and, at last, fully understood. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.